Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Worth Your Time podcast on video. I'm Ericka, your host, coming to you from Indianapolis as usual. And I'm so excited today to talk with my guest, Kaitlyn Schiess. Thank you so much for joining us, Kaitlyn.
Yeah, thanks for asking me.
Yeah, I know I've been talking with you for like several months. I keep popping in. I'm like, I'm going to have you on the podcast. And it's just like life got crazy. And then there was Christmas. But I read your book, I think even before it came out. And so I've been excited to talk with you. This concept of faith and politics and how they intertwine is a passion of mine and something that I really care about. So I think I saw your book was coming out, like, I don't know, at least 6 months before it was available, and immediately was like, okay, that's for me. I've got to read that. This is going to be amazing. And I saw Michael Weir was writing your foreword, and I have such respect for him and the work that he does and has done with the AND campaign and just his own writing. So I knew it was going to be great. And so your book is called The Liturgy of Politics. And I want to get into that. But before we do, tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you're doing these days.
Yeah, so I am a seminary student at Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas, and so I'm in my last semester, which is really exciting.
Yes.
And basically from the time I started this program 5 years ago, which is crazy, I've been writing about faith and politics, and have been working at a local church in Dallas. So I've been doing ministry first with children and then with young adults, but then throughout all that time, writing about faith and politics and taking every opportunity in all of my classes to do that as well. I went to school for political science and thought I was going to go to law school. And then God really redirected my path to seminary. And I kind of thought, okay, I'm done with that other stuff I was doing. And instead, it has just continued to be more of the same, but from this different perspective of thinking about the church and thinking about spiritual formation in particular.
That's awesome. I myself recently, I've just really been digging into the Bible and have just gotten more and more interested in just how it all works together. And I have found myself for the first time in my life saying, man, I kind of would like to go to seminary. Like, I see what the draw is. Like, even I don't want to be a pastor or anything like that. But the more you start to read about these things and see how everything intertwines and how there's just so much to learn, it's like you want to go. So I was reading your bio on your website and I noticed that you were on the debate team in college, which I thought was very cool. What inspired you to be on the debate team? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I actually chose my college for that reason. I was like in high school, I was a military kid. So I went to a couple different high schools, a bunch of schools throughout my whole life. And we didn't have debate at those schools. We had speech tournaments. So I did that. But what I really wanted to do was debate. My parents would probably say it was just I liked arguing and wanted to do that. But, I wanted to be a lawyer and I really enjoyed talking about politics. And so I found a school that had a debate team. And honestly, I think I learned more in 1 year of each of those 4 years of debate than I did in all my classes combined the whole time I was in college. It was just so much research and so much experience having, pretty heated conversations because it was like the debates, but then I spent all my time with debaters. So all we did all the time was, talk about politics, and being at a Christian school, we talked about politics and faith. And so that was, I look back on them like that was one of the most formative experiences of my life. Even now, being more academically interested, it's like it gave me great research skills, like all those things, but also it meant that, everyone in college is kind of going through figuring out what, their parents taught them versus what they think. And I was in school by the time I finished was the 2016 election. So really, important for Christians. And we were talking about this stuff all the time, but I was doing it in this little kind of mini community at my college where everyone there cared about that stuff and wanted to talk about that stuff. And so I can't speak enough about how much that was a great experience and something that I wish more people had experienced doing that, because you spend a ton of your time talking about sources and just how to identify good sources and how to compare sources. And half the time I, spend on Twitter now, I'm like, y'all should have learned some of these things in college.
Yeah. It never even occurred to me to do anything like that. And nowadays I feel very ill-equipped to do any debating or arguing. I'm not very confident in those kinds of things, but it makes sense. And as I've been really getting into lately, lately as in the past few months, I've been getting into apologetics and starting to realize how important that is for not necessarily our personal faith, but just in talking with other people about our faith and just how we sort of relate to the world and what it all means. And so I think it's so interesting. So on the debate team, though, you do have to argue for the other side on an opinion that you don't agree with. So how did that sort of shape your respect for other people's opinions?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I went into college having grown up in a Christian home and have gone to lots of different churches because we moved a ton. So we were at different churches, but very much the same kind of churches, and didn't really know there was much outside of that. And kind of had grown up the way a lot of Christians did of, you know, you're a Christian, you're a Republican, and my parents tell me these are the things that matter. And I just kind of, you know, that's part of the development of yourself, is just kind of taking those things in and then having the time where you critically evaluate them. And doing at a Christian school, I went to Liberty, that was very politically involved throughout. I mean, very recently, publicly very politically involved, but has a long history of the way that Christians have been politically involved in some good ways and in some not good ways. And so it was kind of sometimes a bit of a scandal on campus throughout our history for people to realize that Liberty students were, a few years before I was a debater, one of the topics was overturning one of a list of different Supreme Court decisions, including a Planned Parenthood one. And so like people were really scandalized that Liberty students were debating pro and con on this, this Planned Parenthood decision. But it was really important, you know, to not only be able to empathize with other people, but also to realize, for me at least, how easily information, how much of what we receive as information is really spin on information, and how the bare facts can be, you know, put together in different ways and can, I mean, it was really amazing to me, one debate to the next, I knew the spin to put on the different things. And so on one hand, it really makes you realize how important it is not only to know your sources and know how to evaluate different kind of sources of information, but also just that at the end of the day, like, you're going to have to find people that you trust, institutions that you trust, experts that you trust, because if there's anything I learned in debate, it's that unless you're going to spend the amount of time that we did every single day thinking about certain issues, it's impossible to really pull all those layers of bias and spin off of stuff. And so finding people that you really trust to help you navigate those things, it was just so clear how important that was.
Yeah, I definitely think that's especially important right now, a skill that people don't have. I want to ask you about, so let's see, how long is seminary? Is it 2 years or 3 years?
It's usually 3 years, okay. But I'm in an extra long program, so I am on my 5th year.
Oh my goodness. What makes it longer? Is it you're not taking as many classes?
So we have a full extra year of Greek and Hebrew that we take. And then I took my last what should have been my 4th year, and slowed it down a little bit as I was finishing up writing my book. So.
Wow. Okay, that's intense. Yeah. Well, what I was going to ask on that note was, how has going to seminary changed your relationship with God? Do you feel closer to God now that you know so much more?
You know, it's so funny. Before I went to seminary, I feel like all I heard from everyone, people who had been to seminary, but also a lot of people who hadn't been to seminary, was just like, don't let your faith get dry and academic. And like, you know, it's going to be so hard to actually still care about your personal relationship with the Lord. And and I'm sure that's true for some people. And I never want to make it sound like my experience is everyone's, but I am a nerd and I have loved learning more. And honestly, I mean, one of my classes a few semesters ago, the professor said, if you do all your homework, and the homework for that class was translating and then like grammatically evaluating different passages of the New Testament. So like not devotional type work, like really kind of technical stuff. He was like, if you do your work devotionally, whatever that means for you, I'll give you extra credit. And I remember a bunch of people in the class being like, what? How would we even do that? But for me, I was like, oh yeah, like I translate this passage, I evaluate it grammatically, I think about all the different, you know, nuances of certain words and the way it's constructed. And like, of course that leads me to worship God. Like, I just don't know how it wouldn't be that way. And I recognize, like I said, for some people it's different, but for me, it's been so sweet to realize like I'm never going to be done. I'm anticipating in eternity, learning more and more, and reading things from Christians throughout history that on one level are so different, you know, things that feel very foreign to me. And then sometimes stumbling across things that I'm like, oh, the literal same, you know, political problem or social problem or whatever. It's the same, you know? And so it's really made me, I feel like I'm just so often drawn to praise, mostly for like, wow, I am so small and you are so large and there's no end to what I can learn about you. And one of my favorite things is I feel like every time, especially I have a certain passage of scripture that it's like, I'm writing a huge paper on this, or I'm doing a big, project or whatever. Somehow it's always a passage, of course, because it's seminary, it's a passage that's difficult or like has some problem in it or something. And I don't always leave 100% satisfied with the answers, but every single time I feel like it's better than I thought it was going to be. Like God is better than I thought. How he's worked faithfully in the lives of his people is better than even when I don't feel fully satisfied, I still feel being like, wow, that truth is even better now that I've spent time studying it than it was before. And when I talk to new students, the most thing I say is just like, if you start losing that, then like, take some time, step back, figure out what's going on, because that's the best part of all of this.
Yeah, I've heard that, I've heard some kind of phrasing like, oh, you go to seminary and like people come out atheists or something like that, just people, because it does become so dry. So that's awesome that you've had that, not the opposite experience of that. So, okay. Let's talk about, I wanted to ask you, actually, I was looking at your tweets. You tweeted last week on Wednesday. Of course, I have to look through your tweets as a podcast host. That's what you do. But you tweeted last week, you were urging people, when we're speaking of the day that the Capitol was rioted and terrorized by these people that came in, you tweeted that people should read Revelation. And so I wanted to ask you, why did you urge people to do that?
Yeah, I think I caveated something like, I'm not being doomsday, I'm not trying to, I go to a dispensationalist school, so people would be like, oh, she's telling us like, the end times are coming. No. I just think, especially if you go into Revelation expecting to see a description in really dramatic terms and sometimes really confusing terms, but a really powerful description of especially political idolatry. I mean, early in the book, the description of these churches and what they're dealing with socially and politically, but then in this really symbolic language, a picture of the earth being submitted to an alternate, with very political language, an alternate power, and then ending it with the return of Christ in very symbolic language, defeating that other power. And then especially in chapters 21 and 22, the redemption of all creation, of, the image early in 21 of the one sitting on the throne saying, I am making all things new. Earlier than that saying, God is with his people. They will be his people. He will be their God. I can't read that without just weeping. I mean, it's so beautiful, but I think sometimes Revelation's really scary and confusing. I totally get it. Mm-hmm. But then what we do, because it's confusing, is we tend to overly rely on just like, someone explain to me what it means. I don't need to read it myself. Just like, tell me what it means. Or I'm going to go to this little passage that I understand, or this little passage. And sometimes if you go in and just know, I'm not going to understand every word of it, there's going to be confusing parts, but I just want to read the whole story as a story. And you go in expecting to see that kind of really political language. And then you connect that with the world feels chaotic. It feels like there's political idolatry everywhere. And in this particular moment, it seems like those forces are going to win, or it seems like, where is God in all of this? So to read that, I mean, especially, it's not a hugely long book, to just read it in one sitting and end with that powerful picture of who God is. It's just, that should be comforting to us, not in a super like left behind, do this sort of way, but in just like the truth of it is that Christ is returning, and not returning to just kind of do what some Christians have been tempted in the past to do, of just kind of rubber stamping current political authorities, but to take them out, as he's the true king. And that should just be comforting all the time. But I felt like it was especially comforting on Wednesday.
Yeah. Thank you so much for explaining that. Yeah. I just actually, my whole life have avoided reading Revelation. I have always, even as a kid, I just was always terrified of it. And of course I've read verses here and there, but I was always like, you know what? I'm not going to do that one. And I finally just read it in December, the whole thing, because I did the Bible in a year and I did it. And I'm like, okay, yeah, there's some weird stuff. Like there's some stuff that I don't really want to think about necessarily. But I do think it's so important. Every single word of the Bible has got something for you in it. And I think it's important to read it. And so, and then getting that, just some guidance from someone like you, like, this is a time to read it. Like, it's good to know when those times are. So, so I want to talk about the book. Tell me, when did you start to have this concept in your mind? Like, oh, this could be a book. Like I could actually do this. Tell me about that. And then how did you go from that to here it is in real life on the table?
Yeah, I had no plans to write a book while in seminary. That was not something I set out to do. I pretty quickly upon starting seminary, though, like I said, it was the 2016 election happened right my first semester. So we were talking about it on campus, and I felt like we were talking about it as students and like sometimes with professors outside of class, but I really felt like in our classes, there was so many things that were relevant to the conversation, but we weren't connecting them because we're scared and it's hard. And I took a spiritual formation class that first semester where we spent so much time talking about not just the information we know in our minds, but the way that we are formed and shaped by the habits and rituals in our everyday life. And so I was seeing that in very political ways, just because it felt like that was what was on my mind, and started thinking about that. And then interestingly enough, Molly Worthen, who's a historian at UNC Chapel Hill, interviewed me for this piece that she was writing about evangelicals and politics. And this was probably a year after that, probably in 2017. And we were talking, and I had been reading some James K. Smith, who he talks a lot about rituals and our desires, our loves. And in this conversation with her, it's so funny. It's like she was interviewing me, so I was just kind of answering. But the way that the questions she asked and the conversation we ended up having crystallized so many things for me. I'm so like indebted to her for forever for this. And I left that phone call and I just thought, wow, I think I really want to start, a period of time where I was going to do an independent study. I was talking about doing an internship. I'm just going to spend some time thinking about the intersection of spiritual formation and politics. And then I was working a full-time children's ministry job. I left that job because doing that full-time while being in school full-time and writing, it was way too much. I was so stressed. So I left that job, but also sort of felt like a failure for not being able to juggle all those things. And on the actual day that I quit that job, I went to a classroom, one of our like children's classrooms, to cry because I was just like, what am I doing? I'm such a failure. And I get an email on my phone from Kaitlyn Beatty, a woman that I so respect and have for a long time. Had no idea she knew who I was. She was working at InterVarsity Press at the time. And she was just like, have you thought about writing a book? Are you interested in writing a book? Is there something you want to write a book about? And it was like, this was like days after I'd had this moment where I thought, I think I need to spend a period of time just thinking about this one thing. And it was so perfectly timed. And I think if anything other than that had happened, I would have there's no way I would have done this because it seemed really crazy. And instead it was like, oh, God has just so perfectly aligned all of these things. Put a professor in my path who was willing to let me do an internship, not for her, for her, but to just write my book instead of, working for her, which gave me class credit. Like everything just sort of like came together for it perfectly. And now when people say like, how did you do that while you were in school? It's like, I was at a seminary that helped me, that gave me resources. And I took every opportunity in every class to, shift my research a little bit for what I was supposed to do into something relevant to the book. And now I think, I'm just so thankful that it really feels like this was a product of a community. And I don't know that everyone always gets, I think to a certain degree, that's true of every book, but I don't know that everyone gets to experience it quite the way that I did. And I'm really thankful for that.
Yeah, that's so cool. Definitely being in seminary would help you in shaping your ideas. Now, you talk about spiritual formation, and I think sometimes people hear that word and they're like, what does that mean exactly? So how would you define that?
Yeah, I find it really broadly. Some people would kind of limit it to things like spiritual disciplines or the worship of the church and how those things that we're kind of intentionally doing to form us spiritually, how they shape us. And I would just kind of broaden it because I don't think our lives are segmented into spiritual and non-spiritual things the way we tend to think they are. And so for me, spiritual formation is anything that forms us spiritually. And especially in the context of the book, I use the word liturgies a lot to describe repetitive, embodied things that impart a larger story to us. And so that's why in the book, it's like, I think our worship, our spiritual disciplines are spiritually formative because they're repetitive, they're embodied, they impart this larger story. But then our media consumption habits, the habits that we have about who sits at our table, the grocery store we shop at, the school we're at, all of those are repetitive, embodied, and impart a larger story to us and shape us spiritually. And so if we limit that to just disciplines and the worship of the church, I think we're really missing a lot of what is impacting us in ways that we might think, oh, that's just giving me political information, or, oh, that's just where I shop, or those are just the people I tend to know. No, those things are forming you, not just kind of in an everyday way, but in a deeply spiritual way, and sometimes in ways we don't always realize.
Yeah, I think, some people, like, because you talk about in the book, these liturgies or rituals that we're doing without realizing it. And so I guess looking at the Christian landscape specifically, in the United States, what are maybe some of those conscious or subconscious rituals that you see Christians doing that aren't helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest ones, especially as we're just coming out of, I mean, I guess not just anymore. It feels like this election. There's no election season anymore. It's just
Yeah,
election all the time. But
right.
especially in this last election season, it felt like our media consumption habits were things that I thought people are not just uncritical. I mean, it's pretty common right now to say, hey, make sure you're diversifying your sources, make sure you're not listening to one thing exclusively. But just thinking about like, not just what you're watching, but the habits you have about watching or reading or listening. I went through a period of time where I would get up in the morning and the very first thing I would do was listen to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal podcasts, like daily news podcasts. And I still do that, but I no longer do it first thing in the morning because I realized that it was not healthy for me. It wasn't a good spiritual practice for the very first thing in my ears and in my mind in the morning, just to be, whatever the new thing that was happening was, especially during COVID is when I realized it, because it was just COVID information and I went, this is causing me to be not in an appropriate state of caution, but in a state of fear that is spiritually harmful for me. And I need to figure out how to fix that. So not just what we're listening to, but when we're listening to it, the posture of our hearts when we're listening to it, and our attentiveness and our critical, thinking while we're listening to it. I have like a little thing on my wall over here that has a list of questions about what is this asking me to love? Who is it asking me to hate? What story is it asking me to live into? What vision of the good life is it kind of giving me? And if we're not asking those questions, especially of, things like video and audio that can have such a really, strong pull on our heart, our emotions, our desires, we're going to be in a place we didn't mean to be. We're going to learn desires and fears we didn't mean to learn. So things like that. But another big one for me is looking at our habits and it's hard with COVID right now, but this could be a good time to think about it before we're back in a post-COVID world. But thinking about our habits in terms of who's around our table, what kind of, people are they all like us? Are they not? And what parts of our neighborhood and our community are regular places for us to be? And the reason that matters to me, the table one should be obvious. Do I have relationships with people who are different from me? And not just relationships where I serve them, but relationships where they bring a pot of food to my house and I, have a meal with them. But then also, am I exposed to the diversity even in my own neighborhood? I live in Dallas, and like one neighborhood over, two neighborhoods over is a different world from where I'm at. And are my habits for where I go to shop and the school, the community center that I see and the place that I vote, do I have habits where I'm around other people, I'm exposed to the needs of other people, and I'm not kind of siloed in the one place I'm in? And I think things like that, where we send our kids to school, where we grocery shop, all those things, we could be making exactly the right decisions right now, but sometimes we're just uncritical when it comes to thinking about those things as habits that form us in spiritual ways.
Well, I love all those questions that you said. Did you say those are written on your wall or something?
Yeah.
I think those are such great questions. I mean, I don't know, for people that were listening, maybe I'll go back and like type those out, but I think it's just like even having that intention, like,
Yeah.
Even throwing out like, how are we going to change the culture and all of these things,
Right.
even just starting small like that and having your own personal intentions about what you're doing and listening and watching, that right there can really be the seed to start to make a difference, not in just your own life, but in the country as a whole. So I think those are great. Now you talked about, and I love this concept in your book. I also interviewed Megan Westra. You know her?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I told her I was sort of like read your books like right in a row, and I noticed some similar themes. And one of those themes that I loved so much, and it was something that I truly just had not thought about much before, was this concept of like the more modern conservative church, a Christian church, just of the Jesus and me relationship, where it's all about this personal relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
And like, if you raised your hand at the service and you went forward and you accepted Jesus as your savior, like you're good, that's your ticket to heaven, and like end of story. But when you read the Bible and you look at Acts and you look at the Old Testament too, like you see that it's never been about one person. It's always about a people, and it's always about this community and the church. And so much of, I guess, the modern thought process has eliminated the importance of that like community side of things. And like you talk a lot about communal scripture reading, and you don't see that much anymore. And how by doing that with other people, you're hearing those verses and you're thinking about how they apply not just to you, but to the people standing beside you and to the people in the larger world. So I don't know what my question is. I guess it's just that, how did this happen? How did we go from this focus on the people in the church to this, it's Jesus in me and that's it?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of it is just outside the church. There was a, philosophical shift through like the modern age of being more individually focused and less communally focused. And then that resulted in, across the world, more like pietistic expressions of the Christian faith. It's more about me and kind of my inner disposition, my heart, less about what I do, and also less about the community that I'm a part of. But one of the things that I think about a lot, partially because I have been at so many churches, grew up all over the country, but one of the really more consistent things is the difference that I think happens in a community when things like communion and baptism are communal events and not individual events. Even in the sense of like, I went to a church when I was in high school where you literally, yes, like a lot of churches, you go up to the front and receive communion, but they wanted you to take it and then kind of go into a dark corner by yourself to think about you and Jesus and take it. And there could be really good intentions behind things like that. But it was just one of those moments when I thought, what a missed opportunity, and what like a seemingly small thing that kind of still reinforces in people's minds the important thing is me and Jesus and my relationship with him, not, communion, like of all of the things that is supposed to be about the people of God together, communion, you would think that would be something. But I think, again, it's that thing of, we're not critically reflecting on, not just because I think in a lot of evangelical churches, we'd go, well, our theology about what communion means is right. Okay, that's good. But if the way that we're practicing it with our bodies, if we lower the lights and we've got some fog and we've got loud music and you can't even tell that anyone is around you while you're doing it, that's teaching people something about themselves and their community. Even if the sermon that's about communion next week is all correct doctrinally and good, they're learning that, but they're also learning from the way that you practice it every single week, or for some churches, once a month or whatever. They're learning things from that. And are we critical enough of, is the practice of the thing teaching the correct, nature of it, not just the words that we say or the doctrinal. This is one of my big things is, we'll pull out a doctrinal statement in a church and be like, this is what we believe. You can't really know until you go to a service. You can't really know what's actually kind of communicated through the way we do things, not just the doctrinal statement that we would write down.
Yeah. Well, and then that sort of leads me to my next question, which is, okay, so a lot of people think of earth and then they think of heaven. And they're not thinking like that something that we're doing here on earth is going to be a continuation into what happens in heaven. And you talk about, I want to find the quote because I don't want to get it wrong. But let's see here. You said, instead of viewing this life, including our political participation during it, as biding our time until true citizenship is fully realized in heaven, we should view our engagement in this age as a glimpse and foretaste into the future. So I think some people have never thought of this. They've never thought about how the work that we do now, including how we engage in politics, is going to somehow feed into heaven later. So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to, again, we should read Revelation. We should read Revelation 21 and 22. And we should think about, one of the first class I took in seminary, one of the very earliest things that we learned that now I grade for this class a lot. So I get to hear it, over and over and over again to new people. And I forget sometimes that the first time I heard it, it was like mind blowing for someone who grew up in the church their whole life. And I was like, what is this story I've never heard before? Of connecting the very beginning of the story, humans created good, creation, the world made good. And, both men and women given this commission to rule and reign, to steward creation, to take what God has given them and create new things, to add human creativity to it. How that very much mirrors, but is in some important ways different than the description in Revelation 21 and 22 of the new Jerusalem, of a city where God dwells with his people on earth, where creation is redeemed. And a city of all things is a picture of human creativity added to God's good gifts. And so there's development from that garden to the city, but there's also some similarities of your commission to create flourishing communities hasn't changed. It's there in the beginning, it's there at the end. And so to me, that's a picture not only of, okay, if those two things are important at the beginning and the end, then that changes how we think about what we do now. But it also means that things aren't, it's not just practice. It's good practice. We should practice, seeking reconciliation in families, seeking justice in our communities, even small things like baking bread and arranging flowers, and like doing just like good, beautiful things. Those are practice for work that we'll do forever and redeem creation. God hasn't changed that commission for us. But then to add to that, are those good acts, like a really, truly beautiful, spirit-empowered act of reconciliation, of justice, of good creativity. Those things will continue through, into the new creation. There's a description of, the kings bringing in their good things from the nations, and just recognizing that they will be appropriately redeemed. It's not like we have to work on our own merit here to kind of create the new heavens, new earth. God is doing that without us. We are not able to create that ourselves. And yet our participation, like all good things, right? I would say if I witness to my friend and they become a believer, that was a work of the Holy Spirit. Yet it was important for me to be faithful and obedient to share the gospel with them. The same thing is true of those kinds of acts of like planting a community garden and doing good work politically. And those are things that if any good is going to come out of it, it is spirit empowered. It is God's action and not mine. And yet it is faithful and obedient for me to continue to participate in it, not only because it's good on earth, but because it witnesses to what we'll do for eternity.
Yeah, that's so good. So I want to ask you about this term, evangelical, fully loaded.
Yep.
Like when you hear that word, because to me these days, when I get kind of annoyed with the term just because people say like, oh, evangelical voters, and I don't really necessarily think evangelical represents Christian anymore. I think of evangelical as a cultural Christian tag or whatever.
Yeah.
And yet it's somehow still like those of us who are Christians, many of us at least, are grouped into that. So what do you think, has this term changed over time? I mean, I know you read a little bit about the religious right and the moral majority. So what is your take on all that now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how, originally evangelical was the difference from, between evangelical and fundamentalist. So you wanted to be an evangelical and not a fundamentalist. It's just funny how those words change. I think it's both helpful to think about, people will talk about the Bebbington quadrilateral, which is like the four things that, theologically in terms of belief, define an evangelical. I think that can be helpful. And if I look at that list, I go, I'm an evangelical. Like I believe conversion matters. I believe in the authority of Scripture, all those four things. And yet, like you said, there's certainly, I mean, it's just undeniable that there's an element of it that's a cultural thing, primarily white Americans who are Protestant, who kind of hold to certain political views. That's how it tends to be used often. For me, at the end of the day, I recognize how tainted that word has become politically. And yet what I want to do is both live as faithfully as I can so that whatever word is attached to me doesn't matter, Christian. I mean, because Christian in some contexts has just the same level of just bad connotations. For someone to be able to say, well, that doesn't match Kaitlyn. Like, whatever connotations I have about evangelical, that doesn't match her. But secondly, I mean, I feel a certain level because I grew up in evangelical churches, because that's been a word associated with all the communities of faith that I've been a part of. I feel a certain level of responsibility to keep using the word and try and make it better, try and be more faithful, try and encourage the communities, the churches that I'm in to be more faithful, and hope that helps. Instead of, I think a lot of people, especially, younger evangelicals will just be like, done with that word. It's too loaded. And I fully understand that. And I think in certain contexts and spaces, in the middle of seminary, I started working at a popsicle store, which is a whole weird story.
Fun.
But it was fun. But I met a lot of people who weren't Christians. I would never have used the word evangelical with them. Mostly because they wouldn't have even known probably what it meant. And if they did know what it meant, it would have probably meant voted for Donald Trump. Like that's probably all it would have been. Yeah. So I didn't use it there, but I don't shy away from using it in contexts where I think it will be generally understood, mostly because I want to be able to say the negative connotations you have don't define it. I want it to be defined by the things that it should be theologically defined by. And I don't want to expect the most marginalized people in evangelical churches, especially our Black brothers and sisters, to feel the responsibility of changing it, because I don't think they need to, but I want to feel that responsibility to be like, I want to make us better for us. Yeah.
So when you look at last Wednesday and what happened, so when I saw that, I was thinking, like, to me, I wasn't thinking that's a bunch of Christians, like, you know what I mean? But I'm seeing a lot of people that maybe are defining it that way, or they're really seeing the evangelical Christian influence, because there were some signs, there were some crosses, some Jesus stuff, Christian music. I mean, do you see that as part of the political ideology within Christianity that took place?
Yeah, I mean, I there's been a lot of talk, as you said, of people kind of being like, how responsible do we have to feel for this? And on one level, I just want to say, I think the more Christian posture is always repentance instead of defensiveness. And so if there's any, sense that we should feel some level of responsibility, I think it would be more Christian to say, let's take that on, not if it's completely dishonest or not if we're being unfairly maligned, but just to kind of say, we're willing to acknowledge that we're capable of more evil than we realize. We should be the first people to be like, we are capable of more evil than
we're the ones that believe that the human heart is not good.
We are the ones that have the most reason, to think that. And then on the other hand, to kind of, I know in my own contexts that whether or not I don't know anyone who was there. I don't know anyone who was like literally storming the Capitol, rioting. But I know a lot of people who believe some of the same things that motivated that action. And so for me, it was more of this should be, for anyone who hasn't really felt like this was really dangerous and important, it should be a wake-up call to go, in our churches, we can't continue turning a blind eye when people are being blatantly dishonest politically, or when they're believing conspiracy theories, or it doesn't mean we can't have legitimate disagreements, of course, but it does mean we can't act like there's no harm to our communities being associated with those things. It means that not only do we have to say, hey, that's not my Jesus, that doesn't represent us, but the added level of not just kind of, oh, that's not our people, because it is some of our people. Instead of going, okay, how can we, with our actions and not just our words, show that we don't want that to be our community? And that's so dependent on a local context. It's so important. I said something on Twitter a while back about like, I don't know what you should tell your people about what happened. I mean, I know you should tell them the truth, but I don't know exactly what they need to hear. But it requires pastors and leaders and moms and dads and families, just being honest with their people and saying, here's this really awful thing that happened. Here's why you'll probably hear it was connected to people that we are and people we care about, our community. How can we live our lives so that it's harder and harder for them to associate us with that? And how can we tell the truth to the people in our communities that are getting closer and closer to that, to hopefully stop them from I don't think anyone storming the Capitol ever thought that's where they would be one day.
No,
there was years and years ago where they were falling down a rabbit hole of YouTube conspiracy theory. How do we stop that at an earlier state in our communities instead of going, oh, it's not that big a deal, that's not a hard, how do we be as honest and have as much integrity as we can?
Oh, so many things come to mind. One is, and I never remember who said this quote, or maybe, I don't think it's a Bible verse. You would know. But it's a quote that's like, live your life in such a way that if someone was speaking badly of you, that no one would believe it. And so I think that's always such a good one to cling to, because no matter what's happening, we can always do that. And the other thing that I was going to say is just, I think it shows the importance of, as Christians, if we're talking about Christians that are involved in this, discipleship. Like, if you are, number one, going to church and involved in your church community, and if you're being discipled, if you're having people hold you accountable and you're asking questions about things and you're thinking intentionally, what's the right and wrong thing to do, you're not going to get to that place. You're just not going to end up hanging off the balcony at the Capitol, or whatever. Because it's, even those people, like, they're not necessarily like evil, but they somehow have gotten in this warped world of sin and ended up there. And like, there's a way to stop that from happening, but you have to be intentional about it. What I wanted to ask you next was just, so obviously you care a lot about the church, and the church is very important. I love all of your sections on that. But obviously 2020, we've seen a lot of people can't go to church. We've been online church. A lot of people still aren't going to church. And so I wonder if that, not being there has made it all worse, has made the tribalism worse, has made the political ideology worse, because when we don't have our real religion in front of us so much, then we're going to this other religion. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, I'm really thankful that my church early in all of this was like, we are going to do what we have to do. We're going to sacrifice our worship preferences so that we can keep our community safe. And now we require masks and all that kind of stuff. But I do think the most optimistic part of me says this should drive all of us to desire in-person communion more when we can get it, when it's safe to have it in whatever, give up some of your rights to wear a mask if it means you can, be with your people, things like that. But the pessimistic part of me thinks a lot of people love being in their pajamas and sitting on the couch watching church on Sunday morning. And I think there's going to be, at least in my church, we had conversations months ago where we were like, when this all finally starts to really, really be done, it's going to be like we're starting all over again with our ministries, with, a service that we have, or with a Thursday night Bible study, whatever. It's like we're starting all over. And that's really scary. But at the same time, we've had this reckoning over the past few months about who we are as a church, what we really believe, how we interact politically. And so again, the hopeful part of me, which is not always the part that comes out, but the hopeful part of me says, could this really be an opportunity as we start to come out of the pandemic in the next few months for us to kind of evaluate, how have we been worshiping together? What are our priorities? How are we going to be different forward, moving forward? I think we've lost a lot. Like you said, I do think it's just amped up our polarization in our churches, our inability to talk to one another. And yet, I also think it's just revealed what was already there. I know at least a lot of churches in Dallas, I've talked to so many people about this. We have, really intergenerational churches, but the younger people and the older people are not, we have no opportunities where we're really talking to each other. And so the last few months seem like, oh, all of a sudden there's all this conflict. Well, it was there. We didn't have something that revealed it for us. And so the part of it that we lament is the part that says that conflict was always there, that divide was always there. The benefit of any kind of revelation like that is that we know what we're dealing with and we can move forward and try and be more faithful. But it's hard. It's really hard. Yeah. People should be praying for their pastors and for the staff in their churches, because between politics and race stuff this summer and COVID stuff, it is really hard.
Yeah. I've been going to church. Like our church meets, we do masks and social distancing and everything, but it's very, very low attendance. It's like hardly anything. And so it's like, I don't know what it's going to look like when things get back, but I agree. Like I've been thinking like it is going to be like starting over, and I think a lot of it, like I've been of the mindset that a lot of this is like the pruning of the branches, where we're going to get back to the, the core like elements, or the, just the things that really matter are actually going to help us thrive in the future. We're getting back to that, which is a good thing. But it's also really hard because you see all these things falling to the ground and it's scary. But I think it's good. And I think God is doing something, even if we can't really necessarily see the full picture right now. Well, Kaitlyn, I could ask you a million more questions about your book. I encourage everyone to read it. Before you go, though, I want to ask you, who have you been reading, listening to? What can you recommend in that regard? And I'm sorry I didn't ask you to prepare for that. I know sometimes it's hard on the spot.
No, you're good. You're good. The one thing, and people I'm sure have heard this already, but the one thing I've been recommending constantly right now is Jemar Tisby's The Color of Compromise. It's just so good and it's so necessary. And he has a video series, if you haven't seen, on Amazon that goes through. So you could read the chapters of the book with a group of people and then, get together and watch the videos. And even just for myself, it's been so helpful, but it's been one of the number one things I've given to people at my church who are like, help me understand what's going on and help me understand specifically, like, why do we have to care so much about this as the church? To be able to say, look at how we have not been anything close to separate from this. We have been deep into it. And so how can we move forward and untangle ourselves from it and be more faithful?
Yeah, that's a good reminder that I got from someone else, actually, when I was talking with Rachel Welcher. She was saying how she wanted her book to be read with groups, like she included discussion questions, and the importance of reading this kind of stuff with other people, so that you're not sort of ingesting and interpreting an idea in your own mind, and then maybe you're wrong, or maybe you're getting it wrong, and then no one's there to tell you, and you're like living life thinking that you've got it. You need people. This stuff is important. Like, you need people to talk it out with, especially when we're talking about a lot of this stuff in your book, which is, people may have different opinions on some of that stuff, but you need to be talking about it, because otherwise it could get sort of distorted in how you're interpreting it. So I think that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know you've probably done a million podcasts, so I appreciate you taking the time to be on mine today.
Thank you so much, Ericka.